A tragic car accident sends ripples through the Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
There was a black Jeep over an embankment, wedged on a tree.
They learned that he had driven off in a rage. Was this a drunken driver who simply went over the side of a mountain?
As the investigation deepens, questions of foul play quickly materialize.
The injuries were more severe than what you would have normally seen in that type of a vehicular accident.
He was in the back seat, which defied all laws of physics.
We felt something was very wrong.
Secrets of infidelity and greed come to light as an unfathomable plot takes shape.
What he told us was this story of having an affair.
They would strip naked and have sex in the open air, not knowing that they were being recorded.
He is willing to fall on the sword for her.
I just don't know how to wrap my head around the thoughts of somebody that could do that.
That is cold beyond cold.
Sevier County, Tennessee is the gateway to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
The thing about Sevier County is I can walk out my back door and I'm looking at the mountains. It's a very small town kind of place. People do tend to know each other. Tourism is another biggie. We bring in a lot of revenue for the state of Tennessee.
On November 6, 1994, two visitors are making their way along the scenic Gatlinburg bypass when they stop to admire the view.
On Sunday morning, two tourists from Missouri went to this lookout site, which is quite well known in the area. Gives a lovely view of the town of Gatlinburg beneath them. It's surrounded by thick forests. It's part of the Smoky Mountains. They walked to the edge, and one looked down and said, "Oh my goodness, someone has had an accident."
And there was a black Jeep over an embankment, wedged on a tree.
They called 911. A ranger showed up to investigate the accident and immediately recognized the seriousness of this situation.
The terrain there, it's trees and shrubbery and brush and things of that nature, and it's rough. Bears and rattlesnakes and all kinds of stuff.
It was Ranger McNutt who responded. When she went down there, she saw a white male with injuries. It had all the markings of an accident.
She immediately noticed the smell of alcohol when she opened the door. The apparent driver was not in the front behind the wheel, he was in the back seat. Was this a drunken driver who simply went over the side of a mountain?
He was bleeding, he had lacerations, bruising. She found that he was not alive, removed his wallet, tried to find out who he was.
It identified him as Kelly Lovera, a lecturer in mathematics at nearby Pellissippi State College and a resident of Sevierville.
Ranger McNutt secured the scene because of our interactions with the park and our relationship. They had contacted us. We figured out where he lived. His wife, Shayne Lovera, had reported him missing earlier in the morning. I said, I know her. I watched her grow up. She had moved back to the area with her husband, Kelly Lovera, 4 years ago.
Originally from Madison, Wisconsin, Kelly Lovera was the quintessential all-American man.
Kelly loved swimming. He loved to play music. He loved to have fun and play cards and games and go riding on his motorcycle. He just made the most of every second of his life.
After graduating high school in 1979, Kelly was accepted to the University of Missouri, where he worked towards a degree in mathematics.
Kelly was a wonderful mathematician. He just was a whiz at it. I mean, I think he was born with that talent.
It was during his senior year that Kelly met the woman who would change his life forever. Her name was Shayne Mills.
He was at school in Columbia, and Shayne went to Stevens College. Kelly was an extremely good swimmer, and he was a swimming coach as a side job to get some extra money. And Shayne went to the pool, and that's how they met.
Vivacious and outgoing like Kelly, Shayne grew up in Gatlinburg, Tennessee.
Shayne had no relationship with her birth father. Shayne and her mother were what I would call kind of working poor. You're living paycheck to paycheck kind of thing.
However, things took an interesting turn. Shayne's mother, Sandra, had good looks on her side, and she was soon dating not just one of the most prominent citizens in Gatlinburg, but the president of the bank, Brent Mills.
She was about 7 when he and her mother married. Brent Mills adopted her right away. He was one of those people that you saw everywhere. Everybody knew him, very gregarious.
They soon produced another daughter, a younger sister for Shayne, Kimmy. So out of this poverty-stricken, if you will, background, Shayne is suddenly elevated not just economically, that is in an upper middle class family, but socially.
I went to Gatlinburg-Hickman High School with Shayne, and we worked together on the yearbook. She was always smiling, laughing, cutting up. When she walked in a room, she dominated it.
She was president of the ski club. She was the junior Miss candidate. She was Miss Everything in that high school.
She was always talking about her daddy or around her daddy. They were very close. She had the run of Gatlinburg. Gatlinburg was her town, and she enjoyed that.
But Shayne's Cinderella story came to an abrupt end in 1984, when her stepfather's bank came under federal scrutiny for alleged fraud and money laundering.
The bank went broke. A criminal investigation took place.
Brett killed himself. I just remember how shocking that was. And it was just a few weeks before Shayne's graduation. Brett Mills' suicide changed everything for Shayne. And I think that there was some measure of shame because of gossip. And so it was to no one's surprise that she pretty quickly left Gatlinburg.
Looking for a fresh start, Shayne enrolled in the journalism program at Stevens College in Columbia, Missouri, where she met Kelly.
When she spotted this handsome young man, he had everything going for him: looks, personality, physique, talent, intelligence. To Kelly, Shayne represented a very attractive, charming young woman.
The couple married in 1985. Within 5 years, they were proud parents to their son Cooper and daughter Casey.
She was a very devoted mother, a pretty devoted wife.
My dad loved his kids very, very much, me and my brother. He was a good dad. He was a really, really good guy.
Kelly was a teacher at first in Missouri, and then they moved to Sevierville because he loved the mountains, and Shayne was from Sevierville. And he furthered his career and got his master's at Knoxville.
Upon graduation, after getting his degree, Kelly obtained a position with Pellissippi State College near Knoxville, Tennessee.
I remember walking the halls with him, holding his hand. He loved his job. He loved his students.
His students talked about what a wonderful teacher he was, and he made learning fun.
He was only a beginning professor, but it was a start. They had 2 young children and a rather limited salary to get by on, so they settled in a small apartment in an area of Sevierville known as Frog Alley.
I remember the tiny little apartment me, my mom, my dad, and my older brother lived in. My parents liked to have get-togethers. They used to have parties.
The complex is like a horseshoe, and they would literally put their tables out in the middle of the horseshoe and eat and drink and party and play cards and just have a good time.
In September of 1994, the Lovera family was elated when Shayne convinced her sister to join them in Frog Alley.
Shayne's sister Kim had moved into the apartment complex just 2 doors down from the unit shared by Kelly and Shayne.
They had lots of friends and fun. It looked like a pretty good life.
But only 4 years after their move to Sevierville, Kelly's life has been cut short in what appears to be a tragic drunk driving accident. As park rangers begin processing the wreckage, they notice something strange.
When the Jeep was found, it was found with the nose, or the front end, pointed downward. Kelly had lacerations, bruising, and different cuts on his body. Obviously, he was bleeding. The back of the Jeep was simply metal, but the blood trail was flowing in the wrong direction.
Its front end up against a large tree, and leaking out the back of the Jeep is blood. Now, how does that happen? How does blood leak out the back end, the high end of a vehicle that's halfway down a mountain?
The park rangers in Gatlinburg called me, and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation said, we have a death. It is made to look like an accident, but we don't think it's an accident. Would you please come over here and look at it and see what you think? We felt that this man has been killed and put here.
Coming up, new evidence throws the accident theory further into question.
Kelly Lovera's blood alcohol level was below the legal limit of 0.08.
You're looking at every possibility, and you're trying to eliminate them one by one.
And rumors emerge as the investigation heats up.
It was kind of common knowledge that he was sneaking around.
That was shocking. Here she is once again in a position where there's a scandal following her.
Investigators in Sevier County, Tennessee, are examining the death of 33-year-old Kelly Lovera after his Jeep was discovered crashed down a steep embankment.
The blood was running backward from the front to the rear, which would indicate that whatever happened prior to going off over the embankment. We felt something was very wrong.
We all came to the scene, but the driver was in the back seat, so that was my first clue. Maybe he wasn't driving a vehicle.
This defied all laws of physics. A vehicle striking a tree at speed does not thrust the driver from the front seat into the back seat. It's just the opposite.
We had to figure out what had happened to him. So after we got the Jeep out, we impounded it, and of course removed the body for an autopsy.
As Kelly's body is transported to the medical examiner's office, CSI searched the Jeep for evidence.
We called the lab to process the Jeep, and we got enough samples of blood for forensic testing.
After the samples are sent to the lab, investigators must next make the difficult visit to Kelly's home to notify his family about his death.
I said, let me go talk to Shayne Lovera because I know her. And so I went up there to tell her that we had found Kelly.
We informed her that we had found her husband deceased in the Smoky Mountains in what appeared to be an automobile accident. That's all we told her.
At this stage, the investigators had a good idea that Kelly had died as a result of foul play. They didn't reveal this to Shayne at the time because there was no hard evidence of it.
Shayne, when we notified her of the death of Kelly, she was, just very much in shock.
A young woman from the next apartment came running up and asked what happened. And Shayne turned to this woman, who was a younger sister, and said, Kimmy, they found Kelly dead.
Her sister came to console her. And at that point, Shayne became distraught.
I don't believe the children really understood what was happening. And, all they knew is Daddy hadn't come home.
It was 4 days after I turned 6. I have no recollection of the day, of a moment that I was told my dad was dead. I have no memory of that.
When investigators ask Shayne when she last saw her husband, Shayne explains that she and Kelly had hosted a party in their apartment complex the night before.
We're trying to establish the timelines of events. She said that they had been partying that night and obviously drinking. And Shayne made the statement that he had been drinking heavily and had gone to sleep on the couch. At some point during the night, she and a couple of others went to pick up some food and came back. According to her, she kind of closed down the event.
Shayne says an hour later, Kelly woke up and began accusing her of flirting with a man at the party.
Shayne said they had had an argument in the middle of the night and he had driven off in a rage.
Shayne said he had been inebriated, and this was at 4:30 in the morning.
She went to bed, got up in the morning, he wasn't there.
We learned that Shayne Lovera had contacted the police department and said her husband did not come home. We started interviewing through the apartment complex, asking people if they had seen anything, heard anything. We were trying to find out if anybody had seen the Jeep and or Kelly leaving at that time. Most of them said, no, we didn't hear anything, or we may have heard them partying. There was a water break very near the apartment that night. We went out and found the guys who were repairing the water leak, and they were out there digging in the street, and a man who worked for the city water department saw the Jeep leave. Now, they did not see who was in it, but they did see the Jeep leave, and this was early in the morning, like 4 or 5 o'clock.
While investigators continue searching for witnesses, they receive the results of Kelly's autopsy.
The medical examiner noted that Kelly Lovera's blood alcohol level was measured at 0.06, which was high enough to make it difficult, perhaps, for him to drive the car as effectively as he should, but was still slightly below the legal limit of 0.08.
Per the autopsy report, the cause of death was blunt force trauma. The injuries were more severe than what you would have normally seen in that type of a vehicular accident.
He had suffered severe lacerations and wounds to the head. It was a dozen or more strikes on his head. This is definitely not an accident. He had been beaten severely with a blunt object in the head, like someone had really took some type of tarn or bat or club to him and just beat him senseless. It was an overkill. Somebody really wanted him dead because you can just feel that what happened to him was a personal thing because of what we gathered from the scene and looking at the body and getting a professional opinion from the pathologist. We felt that what happened to this man happened someplace else. His injuries were too severe. What happened did not occur in the Jeep.
Now investigators must determine who had the motive to kill Kelly.
Was this a crime of passion? Did he forget to pay somebody that he owed money? We don't know until we start eliminating those things. That's what we had to do.
Later that evening, investigators receive a call from a local resident named Jim Burney.
Jim Burney had called and said that he had some information about the actual incident. We learned that Jim Burney had been called early in the morning by Brett Ray to come pick him up in Gatlinburg.
Brett Ray claimed to his friend that he had been at a party at a motel and been left there and needed a ride home. It was very early in the morning, but his friend, being a good, loyal friend, got up, got dressed, went to pick up Brett, and he recognized immediately that Brett was in pretty bad shape.
His pants were dirty from the knees down. Looked like he'd been running or walking through the woods.
And it looked like he had blood on his clothing.
Allegedly, Brett Ray told him that, quote, I did it. I got rid of Kelly.
24 hours into the murder investigation of Kelly Lovera, a local man comes forward and implicates 25-year-old Brett Ray in the crime.
We started developing information quick that Brett Ray was picked up by Jim Burney just a short time before the Jeep was found over the embankment. And he took him to the apartment complex in Frog Alley.
Brett lived in Frog Alley, renting spare room from Kim, the younger sister of Kelly's wife, Shayne.
Investigators begin delving into Brett Ray's past and learn he has deep ties to the community.
Brett Ray was the youngest son of Rick Ray, who was a publisher of the Mountain Press, the only newspaper published in the Gatlinburg area.
They had a nice home with a swimming pool over on the river, and they were quite known in the community by all the locals.
A former Navy specialist in firefighting and vehicle repairs, Brett had left home shortly after high school.
He was having a pretty good career in the Navy. He sailed to the Gulf War and back, and he was actually made a junior officer. But he threw it all away one day.
He enlisted in the Navy, and he stayed a few months and got in an altercation with the chief petty officer and got a dishonorable discharge and came back home.
Brett returned because he simply loved Tennessee.
His dad had hired him, given him a job at the newspaper. I had worked with him, and we were always crossing paths. I always thought of him as the black sheep of the Ray family because he had no ambition about things. He liked being wild, having sex, driving cars, and drinking, and just having fun. He was very young, and he was not all that great about always showing up on time. So the newspaper thing was just not working out.
Brett eventually picked up a job as a motor mechanic in a nearby garage.
Brett was working at Sevierville Tire. They did tires and service work on cars.
Kim, who was Shayne's younger sister, had placed an ad in the paper looking for a roommate. And apparently Brett showed up as a result of that ad.
Brett moved in with Kim. And eventually, Brett became one of Kelly's newest friends. He helped Kelly change the oil in his Jeep, and he took part in the parties at Frog Alley.
According to Jim, that's where Brett began developing an illicit romance.
Shayne was having an affair with Brett.
Shayne would crawl out the bedroom window, go down behind the apartments, and crawl in the window of Brett Ray. Jim Burney said Brett was enamored with Shayne.
Following his statement, Jim directs investigators to a wooded area where Brett had dumped his bloody clothes and other evidence from the crime.
We went back and we did the search. We found plastic bags, men's trousers, a shirt, and some other items of clothing that had blood stains.
There was also a blue blanket with a picture of a unicorn on it. We sent it all off to the TBI lab to do forensics.
Armed with an alleged confession, evidence of a potential motive, and possible physical evidence, authorities quickly track Brett Ray down at his apartment and take him into custody.
Obviously, we questioned him, and we asked him what his relationship was with Shayne. And he denied any sort of affiliation or association with her. We obviously didn't believe that.
Brett explained that they were friends, and then they knew each other from the apartments. He did not admit to having anything to do with the death of Kelly Lovera. He admitted being over there earlier that evening, that they were at a gathering over there and were drinking and partying, and he was there, along with some other people.
When investigators press Brett about his alleged confession to Jim Burney, Brett asks for an attorney.
He was charged with first-degree murder at that point.
Because of the affair with Brett Ray, the police began actively investigating Shayne's involvement in the murder.
While investigators continue to hold Brett in custody, Kelly Lovera's family and friends gather for his funeral, where Shayne's behavior catches their attention.
She was talking and laughing like it was a party, and she didn't talk to any of us. She kind of ignored the whole Lovera family. I didn't see her crying. I don't even remember seeing her go to the casket. You would think somebody whose husband was dead would be at the casket grieving, but there was no sign of it. I just had this inner feeling she was involved.
Shortly after the funeral, investigators are contacted by a man claiming to be another of Shayne's lovers.
Wade Hill came and talked to us. What he told us was this story of having an affair with Shayne.
Wade lived directly across from Kelly and Shayne. According to Wade, Shayne had asked him more or less to help her kill her husband. She told Wade Hill she wanted the children and didn't want to divorce him.
Wade, being a smart man, said no, but after Kelly was killed, Wade came forward and told us all this.
He told us she was looking at books on witchcraft, trying to find a poison that was not detectable in an autopsy.
He was still in contact with Shayne, and as a matter of fact, the morning of his disappearance, she had called him and asked if he'd seen Kelly. He thought she was probably trying to cover her tracks and set up an alibi. It was good information that we didn't have. After this, we knew that she was involved in killing her husband.
Coming up, investigators pinpoint the true location of Kelly's murder.
Using luminol, it lit up like a Christmas tree.
And questions about the ultimate mastermind behind this plot continue to rise.
He was threatening me.
He was threatening me, yes.
She's pointing fingers at him from the get-go.
On November 8th, 1994, 2 days after Kelly Lovera was found murdered, investigators have learned that his wife Shayne had asked 2 of her lovers to kill her husband.
We went back to the apartment and spoke with Shayne.
Police directly questioned Shayne about her involvement with Brett Ray.
We confronted her, and of course, all know, just friends. We party together. We have parties a lot in different apartments, and we all know one another, and we all socialize. When we were talking to her, we smelled Clorox and stuff like that. That place had a real smell of cleaning utensils.
It was a very small apartment, probably 800 square feet. They had the normal things, the television, what have you, but there was one thing. It was when you turn around to go out the door, on the left-hand side of the door was Kelly's diploma from the University of Tennessee.
And we happened to glance at the diploma of Kelly's, and there was a blood splatter on it. It's almost like Kelly was speaking out to us, said, hey, look up here, there's my diploma. So we figured, we found out where Mr. Lovera was killed, and right there in that apartment. So at that point, we took everybody out of that house, because from all the evidence now pointing to that something had happened in that house. One of the agents puts his hand on the couch, and it's wet. He pulls his hand up, and it's red with blood. You could smell somebody tried to clean it up.
It was evident that the crime had actually been committed on the couch.
We called in our lab techs to come up. They have a system called a luminol test, which reacts with blood. So they luminoled that apartment. It lit up like a Christmas tree.
It was amazing at what you saw. We went through all the rooms and even out back where we thought the path of travel was.
Kelly Lovera was dragged out of the apartment, and you could actually see the drag pattern going from the couch through the living area, through the children's room, through a window, to an alleyway where the Jeep was parked. We didn't have DNA back then. We had to type the blood. The blood was his blood type. So we put it all together, and we presented it to the grand jury, and they indicted Brett Ray and Shayne Lovera for first-degree murder.
On December 13th, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation arrests Shayne Lovera for the murder of her husband, Kelly Lovera. During questioning, Shayne refuses to cooperate.
She wasn't admitting to anything. She lawyered up pretty quick.
I was already hearing enough to make me think that she might well have been involved. And I'll tell you, that was shocking. Here she is once again in a position where there's a scandal following her.
I just don't know how to wrap my head around the thoughts of somebody that could do that. if you don't love somebody, just get a divorce.
Following their arrests, both Shayne and Brett post bail and are released on bond, while investigators continue building their case against them.
You're looking for motive and the proverbial why.
Robbie had a detective assigned to follow her for that very reason, to see if they were still having a relationship, which they did.
They had to do this carefully. One of their favorite tactics was to drive to the top of a local mountain in a public area. There they would strip naked and have sex in the open air, not knowing that they were being viewed, recorded, and essentially observed by various law officers in the area.
They would meet, have intercourse, and then she would go on her way and he would go on his.
We had all that documented in video as evidence.
Investigators also delve into the Lovera's financial records.
We always thought one of the motives was money. They were having financial difficulties. Shayne liked to spend money, and she overextended Kelly too.
And it was also a life insurance policy.
We gathered later on that Shayne had called Pellissippi State and asked how much insurance that Kelly had on him.
Kelly's life insurance was basically for only $30,000, although it paid double if his death was a result of an accident.
And in '94, that was quite a bit of money.
If she inherited some money from an accidental death, she probably would have been able to recover what she owed and get out of her current situation.
When investigators receive the results of the forensic testing from the items recovered in the woods, their case is seemingly solidified.
All the blood testing from the blanket, the clothing, etc., went back to the victim.
The unicorn blanket came from Shayne and Kelly's home. That was missing from the house, found near the scene.
We always thought that they might have wrapped him in that blanket to get him outside. Also, they found Brett Ray's blood type in the Jeep, which was another nail in the coffin.
Investigators feel confident they have a strong case as they head to trial. But on January 22nd, 1996, 13 months after Brett was released on bond, authorities receive word that his bondsman is unable to locate him.
He was to report to his bail bondsman, who had put up the $50,000 bail. The bondsman realized he had a runner, told the police, and then went looking for Brett Ray.
Authorities are on the hunt for Brett Ray after he skips bail in Sevier County, Tennessee, weeks before his trial is set to begin.
I'm concerned, because I want to know that justice is going to be served.
On January 26, 1996, authorities surveilling Shayne discover that the fugitive has made contact with her.
We received word that Brett had to skip town to Mexico.
He managed to contact Shayne, talked her into finding enough money to pay for an airline ticket back into the U.S. Shayne wired the money to Brett, and just 2 days later, Brett was on a flight to Miami. As soon as he stepped off the plane, he was spotted by officials who knew he was being sought, and within 50 steps, he was arrested, handcuffed, and flown back to Knoxville. He came back because he had no money. He had nothing to keep him in Mexico. He figured he had better face the music.
Ray jumped bond and fled to Mexico, where Alicia Shayne Lovera admittedly wired him money. Ray was arrested re-entering the country. Both were put back in jail with a higher bond.
With the evidence stacked against him, Brett Ray decides to cut a deal and come clean about his involvement in Kelly's murder on November 6, 1994.
Brett's story was that he had come in after the party to check on Shayne, who was sleeping in her bedroom. He simply touched her to see if she was all right, and as he was leaving, Kelly, who had left early in a fit of rage, returned. Seeing Brett step out of his wife's bedroom, he became furious and began attacking Brett.
Brett told the story that Kelly had knocked him down.
At some point, Brett, in his own defense, beat Kelly with the bat. He said he got into Kelly's car, drove around to the back of the complex, put his body in the Jeep, and drove off to dump the car and Kelly over the mountain.
Despite pressure from investigators, Brett refuses to implicate Shayne in any way.
It would have taken more than one person getting Kelly out of the apartment. He was taking the fall for her.
Authorities know they aren't getting the full story from Brett, so they refuse to cut him a deal.
He wanted to take the plea and say, she didn't have nothing to do with it, and I'll take anything y'all give me. And the district attorney said, no, we're going to try you both. Through the evidence that we collected, I believe Kelly Lovera was asleep on the couch. Brett Ray comes in with a ball bat and starts beating him around the head.
His body had been dragged from the living room into the kid's bedroom and then pitched out a window. I don't care if the kids are asleep. That is cold beyond cold.
The murder happened in her home, and she had to have known about it. There was no way for her to get around that. Because of the cleaning and then the luminol being sprayed, the luminol brought the blood up to the surface. So we believe that Shayne was cleaning up while Brett took Kelly to the national park.
On March 26, 1996, the joint trial of Brett Ray and Shayne Lovera begins in a Sevier County courtroom.
The prosecution claimed that both Brett and Shayne were responsible for Kelly Lovera's death. Shayne's motivation, they claim, was the insurance money, but Shayne needed someone to help her murder her husband.
Shayne was unhappy in her marriage, and they were living not the way she was used to living.
Shayne wanted the money, and she wanted custody of the children, and Brett was her means of getting both.
Brett thought she walked on water, and anything that Shayne wanted, Brett would give because he was so focused on her.
Shayne's defense was that Kelly Lovera had indeed been murdered by Brett Ray, but that Shayne had nothing to do with the death. They claimed Brett Ray was caught up in a rather childish romanticism, and he wanted to be with her.
When Shayne takes the stand, she continues to claim innocence, but admits that Brett had told her he killed Kelly after the murder.
My son's baseball bat was in the living room. And he said he just picked it up and swung at him to get him away from him. And he said that he didn't back off, that he had hit him, I don't know how many times. And then he finally fell back onto the couch.
Shayne's defense was that she was asleep and had no idea that crazy Brett was going to go and kill her husband. It was very apparent that if her lips were moving, she was lying.
Shayne admits that after Brett told her he had killed Kelly, she continued their affair out of fear.
He was threatening me, yes.
He was threatening. And so he was threatening you, so you had planned on his birthday to fix him pina coladas and give him a bubble bath.
They're not my plans, those for kids.
She was not aware, of course, that they had been recorded having sex while out on bond.
When it's their turn, Brett's defense team chooses not to call any witnesses.
Brett's attorney had made the statement that his client did not want to present any sort of defense in this particular case.
Brett is willing to fall on the sword for her. He's going to take the blame, and she's pointing fingers at him from the get-go.
After only a 2-day trial, the jury retires to deliberate. It only takes an hour and a half before they reach their verdicts.
The jury came back very quickly, and they found both of them guilty of first-degree murder. And that meant they were staring down the barrel of life without parole. After the jury's already ruled, Shayne and Brett changed their plea to guilty. What they were bartering for was life with the possibility of parole. The sentence that they both got was life with the possibility of parole at 25 years.
I don't know that there truly is justice. I mean, if she was truly remorseful or sorry, maybe I could agree to what she got, but she wasn't.
I don't feel like she's ever expressed any remorse. Am I sure she's remorseful? I hope so.
14 years into Shayne's incarceration, Casey Lovera attempts to reconcile the relationship with her mother.
I was very, very mad at her for a very, very long time. Lots of anger. I had to let go of that. I was 22. It was Christmas Day. We were at my Mimi's, which is her mom's house in Tennessee. She had never called me, but she was calling her mom, and she knew I was there. And I just decided that if I'm going to talk to you, it's not going to be fake. I need you to admit to your guilt, or there's no point in this for me. So I asked yes or no questions. You admit that you are guilty, and she said yes. You admit that you had a part in my dad's death, and she said yes. It just felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders.
After serving 25 years, Shayne Lovera is granted parole and released from prison in January 2022.
She's walking around free and clear, but Kelly's still dead. He'll always be gone. We won't ever have that joy of having him around.
I wish I could tell my dad how much I love him. I really wish he could see me be a mom. And I know he does see me being a mom. I wish he could be Grandpa. I wish my kids could meet him. I missed out on having a best friend. I just imagine him being there for me through all the ups and downs. It's hard to think about. Maybe it would be the opposite of the life I had, where I was very, very alone. So it's hard. But I just hope that I'm making him proud now.
Kelly's kids lost something precious. They're not ever able to know the man that they could have had in their life. He's in here and will always be in here. And that's the main thing, the memories, the love.
There are moments that divide a life into before and after, though at the time, they rarely announce themselves with clarity. They arrive quietly, often in familiar spaces, carrying with them a weight that is only understood once it is too late to change anything. In January 2008, in the city of Dunedin, New Zealand, such a moment unfolded inside a home that, like so many others, was meant to be a place of safety. It was a private space, removed from the noise of the outside world, where ordinary life continued in small, predictable ways. And yet, within that space, something irreversible would take place, something that would not only end a life, but also force an entire country to confront difficult questions about relationships, control, and the limits of emotional justification. The story centers on Sophie Elliott, a university student whose life, at that point, was defined by transition and possibility. She was living in Dunedin, studying, building her future, navigating the complexities of independence that come with early adulthood. Around her, life moved forward in ways that felt open-ended, shaped by decisions that seemed, in the moment, like part of an ordinary path. Among those decisions was one that, in hindsight, would become critically important: the decision to end a relationship. That relationship was with Clayton Weatherston. What existed between them was not described as stable or balanced. Instead, it carried elements that would later be understood as controlling and obsessive. At the time, those elements may not have been fully visible or may have been difficult to define. Relationships, especially in their earlier stages, often contain complexities that are only clearly recognized once they begin to unravel. But what is known is that Sophie chose to end it. She made a decision that many people make at some point in their lives, a decision to step away, to establish a boundary, to say that something is no longer acceptable. It is, on the surface, an ordinary act. But in certain circumstances, it can carry consequences that are anything but ordinary. Because not all endings are accepted equally. For some, rejection is not simply a moment of disappointment or loss. It becomes something more, something that challenges identity, control, and perception of self. And when that happens, the response can shift from emotional to something far more dangerous. On that day in January, the two of them came together again, this time in Sophie's home. The details of what was said in that moment are not preserved as a transcript, not captured in a way that allows us to reconstruct the conversation word for word. But what is known is that there was an argument, an escalation, a movement from tension into confrontation. And within that confrontation, something changed. What had been a relationship, however strained, became a situation defined by violence. Weatherston attacked Sophie with a knife. The act itself was not brief, not impulsive in the sense of a single motion. It continued, extended, reaching a level of intensity that is difficult to comprehend. Sophie sustained more than 200 stab wounds, many of them concentrated on her face, neck, and chest. The number alone conveys a sense of repetition, of persistence, of an act that did not stop at the point where harm was already certain. It is this detail that has led the case to be described as one of the most brutal murders in New Zealand's history. But beyond the number, beyond the classification, there is something else that emerges, a question about intent, about what drives a person to continue an act of violence far beyond what is necessary to cause death. This is not a question that can be answered easily, and it is not one that the facts alone can fully resolve. What can be said is that the violence marked a definitive end, not only to Sophie's life, but to the possibility of returning to anything that existed before that moment. The space that had once been a home became the site of something else entirely, something that would later be examined, analyzed, and discussed in courtrooms and public discourse. In the immediate aftermath, there's often a tendency to search for clarity, to look for a single point where everything can be explained. But cases like this resist that kind of simplification. They do not begin at the moment of violence. They are shaped by what comes before, the dynamics of a relationship, the patterns of behavior, the decisions that lead individuals to remain or to leave. And they do not end at the moment the violence stops. Instead, they continue, unfolding through investigation, legal proceedings, and a broader societal response that follows. What makes this case particularly significant is not only the severity of the act itself, but what it came to represent. It became more than an isolated event. It became a focal point for discussions about how relationships can shift from connection to control, about how rejection can be perceived not as an end, but as a challenge, and about how systems respond when violence is framed as a reaction to emotional provocation. These are not abstract concerns. They are rooted in the details of what happened, in the decisions that were made, and in the consequences that followed. And as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that the moment in that Dunedin home was not just an endpoint. It was also a beginning, the beginning of a process that would examine not only the actions of one individual, but the frameworks through which those actions would be judged. Because when a crime occurs within the context of a relationship, the questions it raises extend beyond the immediate facts. They reach into the ways in which people understand responsibility, intention, and the boundaries that define acceptable behavior. This is where the case of Sophie Elliott takes on a broader significance. It is not only about what happened in that room, but about how that event was interpreted, contested, and ultimately used to reshape the conversation around violence and accountability. The story begins, then, not with answers, but with a moment, one that cannot be undone, one that demands to be understood, and one that continues to echo long after the violence itself has ended. To understand what was lost in January 2008, it is necessary to move away from the moment of violence and return to the life that existed before it, a life that, like so many others, was defined not by tragedy, but by possibility. Sophie Elliott was a university student living in Dunedin, a city known for its academic rhythm and its sense of contained community. She was enrolled at University of Otago, an environment that represents transition for many young people, a place where identity begins to take clearer shape, where independence is tested, and where relationships, both friendships and romantic, become part of that process of becoming. There is a particular kind of life that unfolds during these years. It is often structured yet open, guided by study, but filled with moments that feel unscripted. Choices are made with a sense of immediacy, but also with an underlying belief that there is time to adjust, to change direction, to grow. Within that context, relationships carry a different weight. They are part of learning about connection, about boundaries, about what is acceptable and what is not. Sophie's life existed within that framework. She was not defined by a single role or a single moment. She was part of a broader trajectory that was still unfolding. It is important to hold on to that understanding, because the way a life ends can sometimes overshadow the way it was lived. But in this case, the contrast between those two realities is precisely what gives the story its emotional depth. Within that setting, Sophie entered into a relationship with Clayton Weatherston. At its beginning, like many relationships, it likely carried elements of connection and interest. But over time, the nature of that relationship began to reveal characteristics that would later be described in more defined terms. It was not stable. It did not maintain a consistent balance between two individuals moving in mutual understanding. Instead, it showed signs of something more uneven, something shaped by control and by an intensity that did not align with a healthy dynamic. These descriptions are not based on isolated incidents, but on a pattern that emerged as the relationship progressed. Control, in this context, is not always immediately visible. It can manifest in subtle ways, through expectations, through reactions, through an insistence on maintaining influence over another person's choices. Obsession, similarly, does not always present itself as something extreme at first. It can appear as attention, as investment, as a heightened focus that gradually becomes restrictive rather than supportive. What is known from the available information is that these elements were present in the relationship between Sophie and Weatherston. They formed part of the environment in which decisions were made, including the decision that would ultimately become central to what followed. At some point, Sophie chose to end the relationship. This decision is critical, not because it is unusual, but because of how it was received. Ending a relationship is a common experience, one that most people encounter in some form. It is often difficult, sometimes painful, but generally understood as part of the natural progression of life. It represents a boundary, a statement that something is no longer working, that it needs to stop. In healthy circumstances, that boundary is respected, even if it is not welcomed. But in this case, the response to that boundary appears to have been very different. For Weatherston, the end of the relationship did not function as a conclusion. Instead, it intersected with traits that had already been present: control, obsession, and an inability to accept rejection. These traits did not emerge suddenly at the moment of the breakup. They were part of an existing pattern. But the breakup acted as a catalyst, bringing those traits into sharper focus. It is within this shift that the situation begins to move from tension into something more dangerous. The refusal to accept an ending can take many forms. It can involve attempts to reestablish contact, to renegotiate the terms of the relationship, or to reinterpret the meaning of what has been said. In some cases, it can escalate into behavior that seeks to override the boundary that has been set. While the specific interactions between Sophie and Weatherston in the period leading up to the incident are not detailed in the available data, the overall characterization of the relationship suggests that this escalation was not abstract. It was rooted in a pattern of behavior that had already been established. This is where the context becomes essential. Without it, the events of January 2008 might appear as an isolated act, disconnected from what came before. But when placed within the framework of the relationship, those events begin to take on a different meaning. They're no longer simply about a moment of violence. They are about a progression, a movement from connection to instability, from instability to control, and from control to a refusal to accept separation. It is also important to recognize that Sophie's decision to end the relationship was, in itself, an assertion of autonomy. It was a choice to step away from something that was not working, to define her own path rather than remain within a dynamic that was unbalanced. That decision reflects a broader principle, the right of an individual to determine the course of their own life, including the relationships they choose to maintain or to leave. The tragedy of this case lies, in part, in the fact that this assertion of autonomy became a point of conflict rather than a point of closure. Instead of marking an end, it became the beginning of a sequence that would lead to violence. The emotional landscape of this situation is complex, but it can be understood through the lens of imbalance. On one side, there's the act of setting a boundary, of moving forward. On the other, there is the inability to accept that movement, the insistence on maintaining control, even as the relationship itself dissolves. When these two forces collide, the result is not always predictable. But in this case, it led to an outcome that would permanently alter the lives of everyone involved. As the story moves toward the events of that January day, the importance of this context becomes increasingly clear. It is not simply background information. It is the foundation upon which everything else rests. Without it, the violence that occurred will be difficult to interpret beyond its immediate impact. With it, the case becomes something more, a study of how relationships can deteriorate, how patterns of behavior can intensify, and how the refusal to accept an ending can transform a personal conflict into a public tragedy. By January 2008, the relationship between Sophie Elliott and Clayton Weatherston had already reached its breaking point. What remained was not the structure of a relationship as it had once been understood, but a fragile and unstable interaction defined by unresolved tension. On the surface, it might have appeared to be a final conversation between two people who had once been close. But beneath that surface, the underlying dynamics were far more complicated, shaped by control, rejection, and an inability to accept separation. On the day of the incident, Weatherston went to Sophie's home in Dunedin. The location itself is significant only in its ordinariness. This was not a secluded or unfamiliar setting. It was her private space, the place where she lived her daily life as a university student at University of Otago. It was a space associated with routine, study, and the normal rhythms of student life. There is no indication that the visit was random. Rather, it occurred within the context of an ongoing and deteriorating personal relationship. When Weatherston arrived, the encounter between them began in a way that, in many interpersonal conflicts, might have remained verbal. There was a conversation, and that conversation escalated into an argument. The specific content of what was said is not preserved in detail in the available record. But what is clear is that the interaction moved beyond disagreement into confrontation. At this stage, The situation was still within the realm of conflict between two individuals who had shared a relationship. But that boundary did not hold. At some point during the exchange, Weatherston produced a knife. From that moment, the nature of the event changed irreversibly. What had been a confrontation became a violent attack. The attack was not brief. It involved repeated actions, resulting in a level of harm that was later described in clinical terms but is difficult to fully comprehend in abstract language alone. Sophie Elliott sustained more than 200 stab wounds. The injuries were concentrated on her face, neck, and chest, areas that are both vulnerable and symbolically significant in understanding the intensity of the assault. The repetition of the stabbing indicates not only the use of extreme force, but also persistence in the act itself. This detail has been central to how the case has been understood in both legal and public contexts. It suggests a level of violence that extends beyond what is necessary to cause death, raising questions about intent and emotional state at the time of the attack. During the incident, there was no indication of intervention or interruption. The violence continued until it reached its conclusion, leaving Sophie fatally injured. The transition from life to death in such circumstances is not something that can be easily captured. In narrative form, it represents a finality that cannot be reversed or altered. Once the attack ended, the situation in the room shifted from active violence to aftermath. What remained was a scene that would later be examined through forensic and legal processes. But in that immediate moment, it was defined only by what had occurred and what could no longer be changed. The significance of this moment lies not only in its brutality, but in its contrast with what preceded it. This was not a random act of violence between strangers. It occurred within the context of a known relationship, one that had already been marked by instability and emotional imbalance. That context does not explain or justify the violence, but it situates it within a sequence of events that have been building over time. In understanding the incident, it is important to recognize both the immediacy of the act and the broader pattern in which it occurred. The violence did not emerge in isolation. It followed a period of emotional tension, rejection, and unresolved conflict. However, the shift from conflict to lethal violence represents a qualitative change that cannot be reduced to prior circumstances alone. The actions taken during those final moments stand as a distinct event with its own weight and consequences. After the attack, the reality of what had occurred became unavoidable. Sophie Elliott's life had ended in that room, in a setting that had once been associated with normal daily life. The presence of extreme violence in such a familiar environment contributes to the lasting impact of the case. It disrupts the assumption that danger exists only in distant or unfamiliar contexts, showing instead that serious violence can occur within private and domestic spaces. As investigators later reconstructed the timeline, the focus shifted from the immediate moment of the attack to the sequence that led to it. The arrival of Weatherston, the argument, the escalation, and the use of a weapon all became part of a structured understanding of how the event unfolded. But even in reconstruction, there are limits. Not every detail of the interaction can be fully recovered, and not every emotional or psychological factor can be precisely measured. What remains clear is the outcome. A fatal act of violence that marked the end of Sophie Elliott's life and the beginning of a legal and societal process that would continue long after that day. In examining the incident itself, it is essential to maintain focus on what is known rather than extending into speculation. The facts indicate a progression from verbal confrontation to physical violence, culminating in repeated stabbing injuries that resulted in death. Within that framework, the case stands as an example of how interpersonal conflict, when combined with unresolved emotional dynamics and the presence of lethal means, can escalate into irreversible harm. The event inside that Dunedin home on January 2008 would later become the central focus of legal proceedings, public debate, and legislative reflection. But at the core of all those developments remains a single defining moment, a transition from argument to violence, and from violence to loss that cannot be undone. After the immediate shock of the discovery inside the Dunedin home, the case involving Sophie Elliott quickly moved from a private tragedy into the formal machinery of investigation. What had occurred was no longer an isolated domestic incident. It had become a homicide case requiring reconstruction, evidence gathering, and legal interpretation. At the center of that process stood Clayton Weatherston, who was identified as the primary suspect due to his direct involvement in Sophie's final moments and the established history between them. From the outset, investigators were faced with a case that did not depend on identifying an unknown offender. The relationship between Sophie and Weatherston was already documented, and his presence at the scene placed him within the immediate scope of inquiry. This shaped the direction of the investigation in a significant way, focusing attention not on discovering who was responsible, but on understanding how and why the event unfolded as it did. In cases of this nature, where the suspect is known to the victim, the investigative process often shifts toward reconstructing emotional and behavioral context. That pattern was evident here. Authorities examined the nature of the relationship between Sophie and Weatherston, noting that it had been unstable and marked by controlling behavior and obsessive tendencies attributed to Weatherston. These characteristics became part of the broader framework used to understand the escalation that led to the fatal incident. At the same time, investigators worked to establish a clear sequence of events. The physical evidence from the scene confirmed that a violent attack had taken place, consistent with the severe injuries sustained by Sophie. The nature of those injuries, over 200 stab wounds concentrated on the face, neck, and chest, was documented as part of the forensic assessment. This level of violence immediately distinguished the case as one of extreme severity, requiring careful consideration of intent and psychological state. As the investigation progressed, attention also turned to Weatherston's behavior following the incident. Reports and observations indicated that he did not display immediate remorse in a conventional sense. Instead, his responses were described in terms that suggested detachment and attempts to rationalize or justify his actions. These behavioral observations became relevant in constructing a broader profile of his state of mind, though they were not treated as standalone evidence of intent. They contributed to a pattern that investigators and later legal authorities would evaluate in combination with other facts. The process of building the case was not limited to physical evidence or behavioral analysis. It also involved situating the event within the context of the relationship dynamics that had preceded it. Sophie's decision to end the relationship was a key element in this context. According to the established facts, Weatherston had difficulty accepting this separation, and his behavior reflected controlling and obsessive tendencies. While the investigation did not treat this as justification for the violence, it was relevant in understanding the emotional and psychological environment in which the final encounter occurred. As evidence was compiled, the case moved toward legal proceedings. Weatherston was formally charged, and the matter proceeded to trial, attracting significant public attention due to the severity of the crime and the nature of the relationship involved. In court, the prosecution's case focused on establishing that the killing was intentional and that it involved extreme violence inconsistent with any claim of accident or self-defense. A central point of contention during the trial was Weatherston's use of the legal defense of provocation. He argued that Sophie had insulted or emotionally provoked him in a way that contributed to his loss of control. At the time of the trial, New Zealand law still allowed for provocation to be considered as a partial defense in certain circumstances. potentially reducing a charge of murder to manslaughter if the defendant was deemed to have been acting under extreme emotional disturbance. This aspect of the case became one of its most controversial elements. The idea that severe violence could be partially excused based on emotional reaction to verbal or relational conflict was met with strong public concern. In the courtroom, however, the legal question was not about public sentiment, but about whether the legal criteria for provocation were met. After examining the evidence and arguments presented, the court rejected Weatherston's provocation defense. The judge and jury determined that the level of violence and the circumstances of the attack did not support a reduction in culpability. Instead, the actions were characterized as deliberate and extremely violent. The result of the trial was a conviction for murder. Weatherston was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. This sentence reflected the court's assessment of both the severity of the crime and the absence of mitigating factors sufficient to reduce responsibility. The decision marked the formal legal conclusion of the case, establishing that the killing of Sophie Elliott was not legally justified or partially excused under the standards of the time. However, the trial did not end the broader discussion surrounding the case. Instead, it intensified public debate about the adequacy of the provocation defense itself. Many observers questioned whether a legal framework that allowed emotional provocation to reduce responsibility for lethal violence was appropriate, particularly in cases involving intimate relationships. The case became a focal point for these concerns, as it appeared to illustrate how such a defense could be invoked in the context of extreme violence against a former partner. Within this context, the investigation and trial together formed a complete procedural arc, from the identification of the suspect to the reconstruction of events to the legal assessment of responsibility. Each stage built upon the previous one, shaping an official narrative of what had occurred and how it should be interpreted within the legal system. Yet even as the case moved through these stages, it also began to influence thinking beyond the courtroom. The combination of factual evidence, behavioral analysis, and contested legal defense created a case study that would later contribute to broader discussions about domestic violence, emotional control, and the limits of legal mitigation based on provocation. In this way, the investigation and trial were not only about determining guilt, but also about defining the boundaries of acceptable legal reasoning in cases of extreme interpersonal violence. The courtroom phase of the case involving Sophie Elliott did not unfold in isolation. By the time proceedings began, the facts of the case were already widely known, and public attention in New Zealand had become intense. The brutality of the killing, the relationship between Sophie and Clayton Weatherston, and the legal arguments that would follow had already placed the case under a national spotlight. What remained for the court was not the discovery of what had happened, but the formal legal interpretation of responsibility, intent, and possible mitigation. The trial took place in a setting where the central facts were largely uncontested in their broad outline. It was established that Weatherston had gone to Sophie's home in Dunedin, that an argument had occurred, and that he had attacked her with a knife, causing fatal injuries. The forensic reality of the case was not in dispute. Sophie had suffered more than 200 stab wounds, concentrated on her face, neck, and chest, marking the incident as one of extreme violence. The legal question was not whether Weatherston had caused her death, but how the law should classify his actions and whether any mitigating factors could reduce his culpability. A significant focus of the trial was the defense's reliance on the concept of provocation. At the time, New Zealand law allowed for provocation to be considered as a partial defense in homicide cases. If successfully argued, it could reduce a charge of murder to manslaughter on the basis that the defendant had lost self-control due to extreme emotional provocation. Weatherston's defense team argued that Sophie had insulted and emotionally provoked him during their final interaction, contributing to a loss of control that led to the fatal attack. This argument placed the court in a position where it had to evaluate not only the actions themselves, but also the emotional context in which those actions occurred. However, the prosecution presented a different interpretation. They emphasized the scale and duration of the attack, highlighting the extreme number of stab wounds as evidence that the violence was sustained and deliberate rather than a momentary loss of control. The nature of the injuries was central to their argument that the act could not reasonably be reduced to a spontaneous emotional reaction. Instead, it reflected a level of violence that indicated intent and persistence. The courtroom examination of Weatherston's behavior also became a key element of the case. Observations about his demeanor and his attempts to explain or justify his actions were introduced as part of the broader assessment of his credibility and mindset. These observations were not treated as standalone proof of guilt, but they contributed to the overall picture presented to the court regarding his response to the events. In addition to the legal arguments, the trial also brought into focus the broader implications of the provocation defense itself. The idea that severe emotional disturbance could reduce responsibility for lethal violence became a subject of significant public concern. In this case, the defense's argument was seen by many as problematic because it appeared to shift attention from the actions of the offender to the behavior of the victim. The court, however, was required to apply the law as it existed at the time, evaluating whether the specific legal criteria for provocation had been met. After hearing the evidence and arguments, the court rejected the provocation defense. The decision was based on the conclusion that the circumstances did not meet the threshold required to justify a reduction in culpability. The nature of the violence, the context of the relationship, and the sequence of events all contributed to the determination that Weatherston's actions constituted murder rather than manslaughter. The verdict was therefore one of guilty on the charge of murder. Weatherston was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. This sentence reflected the court's assessment of the severity of the crime and its rejection of any mitigating justification based on emotional provocation. The legal outcome confirmed that the killing of Sophie Elliott was considered a deliberate and unlawful act of extreme violence under New Zealand law. While the trial concluded the legal determination of guilt, it did not conclude the broader societal response to the case. Instead, it intensified debate about the appropriateness of the provocation defense itself. The idea that emotional reaction could be used to partially justify lethal violence was increasingly challenged in public discourse, particularly in cases involving intimate relationships. The Elliott case became a focal point for this debate because it illustrated how such a defense could be applied in a context involving severe violence against a former partner who had clearly ended the relationship. In the aftermath of the trial, attention shifted beyond the individual case to the structure of the law itself. The controversy surrounding the use of provocation as a defense contributed to growing pressure for legal reform. Critics argued that the defense risked excusing behavior that should be fully accountable under the law, particularly in cases where violence followed rejection or separation in a relationship. This discussion eventually led to legislative change in New Zealand. In 2009, the provocation defense was abolished. The reform was explicitly connected to concerns raised by cases such as this one, where the defense was seen as potentially minimizing responsibility for serious violence and shifting focus toward the actions of victims rather than offenders. The removal of provocation from New Zealand law marked a significant shift in how the justice system approached claims of emotional loss of control in homicide cases. It reflected a broader commitment to ensuring that lethal violence could not be legally mitigated on the basis of emotional provocation alone. In this sense, the trial of Clayton Weatherston had consequences that extended beyond the individual verdict. It became part of a wider legal and social transformation, influencing how future cases would be evaluated and how responsibility in violent relationships would be understood. The courtroom decision, while concluding the case in legal terms, thus became a starting point for broader reflection on the boundaries of legal defense and the importance of protecting victims from narratives that risk diminishing the severity of violent acts. After the courtroom doors closed and the sentence was delivered, the case involving Sophie Elliott did not fade into history in the way many criminal cases eventually do. Instead, it remained present in public consciousness, not as a distant memory, but as an active reference point in discussions about violence, relationships, and the limits of legal justification. The conviction of Clayton Weatherston brought legal closure in the strict sense, but socially and emotionally, the case continued to resonate far beyond the courtroom. One of the most immediate and visible outcomes was the reaction from Sophie Elliott's family. Her parents, particularly her mother, became central voices in the aftermath, not through legal argument, but through public advocacy. They spoke about Sophie not as a case file or a legal subject, but as a daughter whose life had been defined by more than the way it ended. Their focus extended beyond the individual tragedy to the broader issue of relationship violence and the warning signs that can precede it. In doing so, they helped shift the public conversation from the courtroom outcome to the lived realities of emotional control and coercion within intimate relationships. The case also became a focal point for national reflection in New Zealand on the nature of domestic and relationship violence. One of the most significant outcomes of this reflection was the reassessment of the legal concept of provocation. Although the court in Weatherston's case rejected the defense, the very fact that it had been raised in the context of such extreme violence generated widespread concern. Many questioned whether a legal framework that allowed emotional provocation to be considered as a partial defense to homicide was appropriate in modern law. Critics argued that it risked implicitly shifting responsibility away from the perpetrator and toward the victim, particularly in cases where rejection or separation was involved. This concern was not abstract. It was directly connected to how the facts of the Elliott case were perceived. A young woman had ended a relationship, and that decision had been followed by extreme and fatal violence. The idea that such violence could be partially mitigated by reference to emotional distress was increasingly seen as incompatible with contemporary understandings of accountability. This shift in perspective contributed directly to legislative reform. In 2009, New Zealand abolished the provocation offense. The change was not made in isolation, but as part of a broader recognition that the legal system needed to ensure clearer boundaries around responsibility in cases of homicide. The reform was widely interpreted as a response to concerns highlighted by cases such as this one, where the application of provocation was seen as potentially undermining the seriousness of intentional lethal violence. In this way, the legal legacy of the case extended beyond the sentencing of Weatherston. It became part of a structural change in how New Zealand law approached emotional justification in murder cases. Beyond legal reform, the case also had a significant impact on public awareness of controlling and obsessive behavior in relationships. The description of the relationship between Sophie and Weatherston, as it emerged during the investigation and trial, contributed to a broader understanding of how coercive dynamics can develop. While not every detail of their relationship was publicly known, the characterization of control, emotional intensity, and inability to accept separation became central themes in how the case was interpreted. These themes resonated with wider discussions about relationship warning signs, particularly the idea that unhealthy dynamics are not always immediately visible, but can escalate over time. Educational and advocacy efforts in the years following the case increasingly emphasized the importance of recognizing early indicators of controlling behavior, emotional dependency, and possessiveness. Sophie's story became part of this broader conversation, not as an isolated incident, but as an example used to illustrate the potential consequences of such dynamics when they remain unaddressed. At the same time, the case continued to be examined within legal and academic contexts. It is frequently referenced in discussions about the limitations of emotional defenses in criminal law, particularly in jurisdictions that have since reformed or abolished provocation-style arguments. Scholars and practitioners have used the case to explore how legal systems should balance the need to understand human emotion with the requirement to maintain accountability for violent actions. One of the key points of reflection is the difficulty in distinguishing between explanation and justification. While emotional context can help explain behavior, it does not necessarily justify or mitigate responsibility for extreme harm. The Elliott case illustrates the tension between these two concepts, showing how easily they can become blurred in courtroom arguments. The broader societal impact also includes a heightened awareness of how cases involving young victims and intimate relationships are perceived and discussed. There has been increased sensitivity to the language used in describing such cases, with greater emphasis on avoiding narratives that implicitly shift responsibility away from perpetrators. This shift reflects a growing understanding that the framing of a case can influence public perception in ways that extend far beyond the legal outcome. In the years since the incident, the memory of Sophie Elliott has been preserved not only through media coverage and legal documentation, but also through ongoing efforts to contextualize her story within broader issues of safety and respect in relationships. Her case is often cited in discussions about why early intervention, education, and awareness are critical in preventing similar tragedies. These discussions focus less on the details of the crime itself and more on the conditions that can allow controlling and obsessive behavior to escalate without intervention. Ultimately, the legacy of the case is multi-layered. At its most immediate level, it is the story of a young woman whose life was ended by extreme violence. At a legal level, it is a case that contributed to significant reform in the way emotional defenses are treated in homicide law. At a social level, it has become part of a broader conversation about relationship dynamics, personal autonomy, and the importance of recognizing harmful patterns before they reach a point of irreversible consequence. Even after the legal proceedings concluded and the sentence was handed down, the case continued to evolve in meaning. It shifted from being solely about a crime and its punishment to being about prevention, understanding, and reflection. In that sense, the aftermath is not an ending, but an ongoing process, one in which the story of Sophie Elliott continues to serve as a reminder of how fragile the boundary can be between everyday life and irreversible tragedy, and how important it is for legal systems and societies alike to continually examine how they interpret, respond to, and learn from such events. What remains after the legal verdict, the public reaction, and the legislative reform is not closure in the traditional sense, but a slow, ongoing process of interpretation. The case of Sophie Elliott continues to exist in a space where law, memory, and social understanding overlap, refusing to settle into a single, uncomplicated meaning. Even though Clayton Weatherston was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, the case itself has continued to be revisited, not because the facts are in doubt, but because their implications remain deeply significant. One of the most important aspects of this case is how it illustrates the difficulty of separating explanation from justification in human behavior. The court determined that Weatherston's actions constituted murder, rejecting the claim that emotional provocation could reduce his responsibility. Legally, this created a clear boundary. Extreme violence in response to emotional conflict does not diminish criminal liability. However, in broader social discussion, the question has remained more complex. People continue to examine how emotional states, relationship dynamics, and psychological traits interact in situations that escalate into violence. This ongoing examination does not challenge the verdict itself, but rather explores how such outcomes might be understood and, more importantly, prevented. In this way, the case has become part of a wider framework used to study coercive and controlling behavior in relationships. The relationship between Sophie and Weatherston is often referenced in discussions about how control can develop gradually, sometimes in ways that are not immediately recognizable from the outside. While the available facts describe the relationship as unstable and marked by controlling and obsessive tendencies, the broader lesson drawn from the case is about awareness, how patterns of behavior, rather than isolated incidents, can signal risk. This perspective has influenced educational efforts focused on helping individuals recognize unhealthy relationship dynamics earlier. It is not about attributing blame after the fact, but about identifying warning signs before situations escalate. Another layer of reflection concerns the role of the legal system itself. The trial demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of courtroom processes in handling cases that involve intense emotional narratives. On one hand, the court was able to clearly establish responsibility and reject a defense that sought to reduce culpability. On the other hand, the very existence of that defense raised questions about how the law interprets emotional distress in the context of lethal violence. The subsequent abolition of the provocation defense in New Zealand in 2009 reflects an institutional response to these concerns. That reform did not arise solely from this case, but this case played a significant role in shaping the debate that led to change. It highlighted the risk that legal frameworks, if not carefully structured, can be used to shift focus away from the actions of the offender and toward the behavior of the victim. The removal of provocation as a defense represented a deliberate move toward reinforcing the principle that emotional state does not excuse intentional killing. Beyond legal and educational impacts, the case also continues to carry a human dimension that resists abstraction. Sophie Elliott is often remembered not as a symbol or a legal precedent, but as an individual whose life was defined by far more than its final moments. This distinction is important because it prevents the case from being reduced solely to its most extreme element. Her life included ordinary experiences of study, relationships, and personal development, all of which were interrupted by a violent act that became the focus of national attention. Preserving that broader understanding is part of how the case is discussed today, particularly by those advocating for awareness around relationship violence. At the same time, the figure of Weatherston remains part of the case's continuing significance, not as a subject of focus in isolation, but as an example of how legal systems assess responsibility in cases involving extreme interpersonal violence. The rejection of his provocation defense and the confirmation of a murder conviction reinforce a legal standard that prioritizes accountability even in emotionally charged circumstances. This has influenced how similar cases are approached, both in courtrooms and in public discourse. Over time, the case has also become a reference point in academic and professional discussions about forensic psychology, criminal law, and social behavior. It is studied not because it offers simple answers, but because it presents a complex intersection of emotional dynamics, legal interpretation, and social response. In this sense, its value lies in its complexity rather than in any single conclusion. It forces ongoing engagement with difficult questions: how violence emerges in intimate relationships, how the law should respond to emotional arguments in criminal cases, and how societies can better recognize and respond to patterns of control before they escalate into harm. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the case is that it does not allow for finality in interpretation. While the legal outcome is settled, the meaning of the case continues to evolve as new perspectives on relationship dynamics and violence develop. Each time it is revisited, it serves as a reminder that justice, while capable of delivering verdicts, is not always capable of fully containing the significance of what has occurred. The story of Sophie Elliott, therefore, does not end with the conviction of her killer or the reform of the law that followed. Instead, it continues as part of a larger effort to understand how human relationships can shift from connection to harm, and how systems of justice and society at large can respond more effectively to those shifts. In that ongoing process, the case remains not a closed chapter, but an active point of reflection, one that continues to inform how violence, responsibility, and prevention are understood in a broader sense. If there is a final way to understand the case of Sophie Elliott, it is not through a single conclusion, but through the accumulation of all the questions it continues to leave behind. Even after the conviction of Clayton Weatherston, after the life sentence, and after the legal reform that followed, the case does not settle into silence. Instead, it remains present as a structured reminder of how fragile the boundaries are between private relationships, emotional conflict, and irreversible violence. At its most basic level, the case is about a young woman whose life ended in an act of extreme brutality inside her own home. That fact does not change, and it is the foundation upon which everything else is built. But surrounding that fact are layers of interpretation that have continued to evolve over time. The legal system addressed the question of responsibility and answered it clearly. Murder had been committed, and the defense of provocation could not reduce that responsibility. That legal clarity is important because it establishes accountability in a case defined by emotional complexity. However, legal clarity does not automatically translate into emotional or social resolution. The broader impact of the case has been shaped by how people interpret the relationship between Sophie and Weatherston, and how they understand the progression from emotional conflict to lethal violence. The description of that relationship as unstable, controlling, and obsessive has become central to discussions about warning signs in intimate partnerships. It is not presented as a simple explanation for what happened, but as part of a pattern that can be recognized in other contexts. This recognition has influenced how educators, advocates, and legal professionals talk about relationship safety. The focus has shifted toward identifying early indicators of coercion and control, rather than only responding after harm has occurred. In this sense, the case has contributed to a broader cultural shift, one that emphasizes prevention alongside accountability. Another important aspect of its legacy is the way it has shaped legal thinking about emotional defenses. The abolition of the provocation defense in New Zealand in 2009 marked a significant change in how the justice system treats claims of emotional loss of control in homicide cases. While the reform was influenced by multiple cases and ongoing legal debate, the Elliott case played a visible role in that discussion. It highlighted the concern that emotional provocation, if accepted too broadly, could risk diminishing the responsibility of individuals who commit severe acts of violence. By removing this defense, the legal system reinforced a principle that emotional response does not excuse intentional killing. This change reflects a broader commitment to ensuring that the focus remains on the actions of the offender rather than the behavior of the victim. At the same time, the case continues to be examined in academic and professional contexts as an example of how complex interpersonal dynamics can intersect with legal processes. It is studied in relation to coercive control, forensic psychology, and the interpretation of intent in violent crime. These discussions do not seek to reinterpret the verdict, but to understand the conditions that can lead to such outcomes and how similar situations might be identified earlier in the future. One of the most persistent themes that emerges from these reflections is the difficulty of recognizing escalation in real time. Relationships rarely move in a straight line from stability to violence. Instead, they often involve gradual shifts in behavior, perception, and emotional dependence. The Elliott case is frequently used to illustrate how these shifts, when left unaddressed, can contribute to situations where boundaries are not respected and conflict becomes increasingly dangerous. However, even within this framework of analysis, it is important to maintain clarity about the nature of responsibility. Understanding the context of a crime does not change the fact of the crime itself. The legal system's role is to establish that distinction, and in this case, it did so by affirming that the killing was intentional and not justified by emotional provocation. Beyond legal and academic interpretation, the case also continues to carry a human dimension that resists abstraction. Sophie Elliott is remembered not only as the victim of a crime, but as a person whose life was defined by far more than the circumstances of her death. Her identity as a student, a daughter, and an individual navigating early adulthood remains central to how she is spoken about by those who knew her and by those who continue to reflect on her story. This emphasis on her life, rather than only her death, plays an important role in how the case is understood in public memory. It prevents the narrative from being reduced solely to violence and instead preserves the broader context of who she was. The continued relevance of the case lies in its ability to function as both a legal precedent and a social reference point. It is cited in discussions about domestic violence, legal reform, and relationship safety, not because it offers simple answers, but because it raises complex and enduring questions. How should emotional conflict be understood in the context of criminal responsibility? How can systems better identify patterns of coercion before they escalate? And how can societies ensure that legal frameworks protect victims without inadvertently shifting focus away from those who commit harm? These questions do not have final answers, and that is part of why the case continues to be revisited. In the end, the legacy of the Sophie Elliott case is not contained within a single outcome or reform. It exists in the ongoing effort to understand how such events occur and how they might be prevented. In the future, it exists in the legal changes that followed, in the educational conversations that reference it, and in the broader cultural awareness of relationship dynamics. Most importantly, it exists in the recognition that justice, while capable of delivering verdicts, is not the end of understanding. Instead, it is one part of a continuing process of reflection, learning, and responsibility. The case of Sophie Elliott continues to be remembered not simply because of its brutality, but because of the unusual clarity with which it exposed multiple fault lines in law, psychology, and social perception at the same time. Even years after the conviction of Clayton Weatherston, it remains one of the most frequently referenced homicide cases in New Zealand when discussing intimate partner violence, legal defenses based on emotion, and the risks of coercive relationship dynamics escalating into irreversible harm. One of the primary reasons the case retains such prominence is the scale and nature of the violence itself. The fact that Sophie suffered more than 200 stab wounds, concentrated on vulnerable areas such as the face, neck, and chest, distinguishes the case as one of extreme and sustained violence rather than a momentary act. This level of force has been central to how the legal system and the public have interpreted intent, reinforcing the conclusion that the act was deliberate rather than accidental or impulsive in a legally mitigating sense. However, the case is not defined by physical violence alone. It is also defined by the context in which that violence occurred. The breakdown of a romantic relationship marked by instability control, and emotional imbalance. Sophie's decision to end the relationship became a pivotal moment, not because it was unusual in itself, but because of the reaction it provoked. Weatherston's inability to accept that separation, as established during the investigation and trial, became a central factor in understanding the escalation that followed. This dynamic has made the case a key example in discussions about how emotional dependency and control can develop within intimate relationships, and how those patterns can become dangerous when boundaries are not respected. Another major reason the case remains significant is its role in legal reform. At the time of the trial, New Zealand law still allowed the defense of provocation to be used in homicide cases, potentially reducing a murder charge to manslaughter if emotional loss of control could be established. Weatherston's reliance on this defense brought intense public scrutiny to the concept itself. Many people found the idea that extreme violence could be partially excused by emotional provocation deeply troubling, particularly in the context of a relationship where one partner had chosen to leave. The court ultimately rejected the provocation argument, affirming that the violence constituted murder. However, the public debate that followed extended beyond the verdict. It raised fundamental questions about whether the law should recognize emotional provocation as a mitigating factor at all in cases involving lethal violence. This debate contributed directly to legislative change. In 2009, New Zealand abolished the provocation offense. This reform is widely associated with the broader impact of cases like this one, which highlighted the risk that such a defense could shift attention away from the actions of the offender and toward the behavior of the victim. The abolition of provocation marked a significant shift in legal philosophy, reinforcing the principle that emotional state does not reduce accountability for intentional killing. Beyond legal reform, the case has become a reference point in educational and advocacy efforts focused on relationship violence. It is frequently used to illustrate how controlling behavior and emotional manipulation can escalate over time, often without immediate external visibility. The relationship between Sophie and Weatherston is not presented in these discussions as a simple narrative of conflict, but as an example of how certain behavioral patterns, such as possessiveness, difficulty accepting rejection, and emotional control, can contribute to unsafe dynamics. These discussions emphasize early recognition and intervention, aiming to prevent similar situations from reaching a point of irreversible harm. In psychological and academic contexts, the case is also examined as an example of how emotional perception can influence behavior in high-conflict relationships. While the legal system focuses on responsibility and evidence, psychological analysis often explores how individuals interpret rejection, loss of control, and personal identity within intimate relationships. The Elliott case is often cited in this context because it demonstrates how emotional responses, when combined with pre-existing controlling tendencies, can escalate into extreme outcomes. Importantly, this analysis does not seek to excuse or justify the violence, but to understand the conditions that can contribute to its development. Another factor contributing to the case's continued relevance is its clarity in illustrating the limits of certain legal arguments. The rejection of the provocation defense established a clear boundary in New Zealand law regarding emotional justification in homicide cases. This has influenced how subsequent cases are argued and interpreted, particularly in ensuring that victim behavior is not used to diminish offender responsibility. In this sense, the case has had a lasting structural impact on legal reasoning, shaping how courts approach claims of emotional loss of control. At a societal level, the case also continues to be discussed because it challenges assumptions about where and how violence occurs. It disrupts the idea that severe violence is distant or disconnected from everyday life, showing instead that it can emerge within ordinary domestic environments and familiar relationships. This realization has contributed to a broader cultural awareness of the importance of recognizing warning signs and taking early action in situations involving controlling or obsessive behavior. Ultimately, the enduring significance of the Sophie Elliott case lies in its convergence of multiple themes: legal responsibility, emotional dynamics, relationship safety, and systemic reform. It is not remembered for a single reason, but for the way it brought these elements together in a way that demanded reflection across multiple fields. It remains a case that is studied, referenced, and discussed not because it offers closure, but because it continues to raise questions about how violence develops, how it is judged, and how it can be prevented.